to do is look at the overall aircraft and see the overall appearance of it. You want to check tires, make sure they're up on both sides. As we walk around, we want to check the general appearance of it as we go around, and we will start here at the front. Check any hydraulic fluid. Check the leading edge. Pitot tube. Bolts. The wheels, we check there's no leakage of fluid, brake fluid. Check, make sure the bolts and nuts are in the right position. Make sure the tire's not low. Check the leading edge. Make sure it's not been damaged. Strut. Make sure all the bolts are connected. Here, 4 points. Here is the Taylorcraft pitot tube with a guard on it for bugs. I'm going to check, make sure that moves freely, because the air, as it gets flying, the air will push this back and cause the pitot tube to become active. Check to make sure there's no bugs on the inside. Continue our walk around the upper strut. Check for the bolts on the back as it should be. Same thing, we check for the back of it here, make sure it's good. Continue along the leading edge. It's a good time to look back along that leading edge, make sure there's no dents or dings. Following around, got the nav light. This is a good time to look at the overall wing to make sure there's nothing wrong on top, everything looks straight, no tears in the fabric. This is when we can move the ailerons. You can check to see one goes up, the other one goes down. We want to check underneath the aileron, make sure the connections are good. What we're looking for underneath would be the carter pins in position, the bolts are in position, and it moves freely. Come to the other one, same thing, we look for carter pins and the little bolts in position. You can see the push rod up here. Make sure everything's in position and it moves freely. And then the third point, same as before, carter pins in place, bolts are in place, nuts, and it moves freely. As we come along, this would be normally where you'd check for flaps. Of course, the Taylorcraft does not have flaps. At this point, we look back, and here's the plate that joins the wings to the fuselage, and you look up through it, make sure all the nuts are secure, and bolts. It's when you can look along the side of the fuselage, make sure there's no tears, everything looks good. You come to the horizontal stabilizer, check where it's bolted on underneath, the bolts are good. This is a good time to check for the rudder cables and tension. This is where the rudder connects to the rudder cable. You can see there's a safety wire here. You got a carter pin here and the nut that holds that in place. On the bottom you have the coupler that holds the wire brace to support the horizontal stabilizer. Here's a nut hanging on to that. While you're under here, we want to look at the underside of the elevators. If you get any rocks that kick up from the tires when you're landing, taking off and landing, it could actually hurt the inside of that. You see here, this is the trim tab for the elevators. You have a control linkage with a nut and a cotter pin. On top of the horizontal stabilizer, you have another support cable that supports off of the vertical stabilizer. Check to make sure the nuts are good. Here you want to raise the elevator up and down, make sure good movement. The trim tab will not move. You just want to make sure it's secure. This is a point that you would check for the rudder. You would check for the tension of the springs, make sure it's not tight but just snug. And the rear wheel at this point, you would check it. The other side, these are, notice there are grease points on here. On the back of the rudder, you see a nav light for the rear, a trim tab for the rudder. This is nothing but a piece of metal that is adjusted on the ground as needed. Once it's set, it's pretty much, don't have to worry about it. Connecting the rudder to the vertical stabilizer, you have a nut on that as well as the bottom. Check that to make sure it's good. The rudder on a tail dragger is connected to the rear wheel, so when you turn that, the whole thing tends to turn. But you can see that wheel moves along with the rudder. Check the other side, the support member for the horizontal stabilizer. Check here. While you're here, you can go ahead and check the linkages for the elevators. Cotter pin in place there, cotter pin in place there, the internal cotter pin for the vertical stabilizers there. Again, move the elevator up and check the rudder cable to make sure that everything's in place. You have a safety wire in place and wrapped around. You have cotter pins on the nut, and the rudder cable, the tension is appropriate. And here you can see these are the stop bolts that actually serve to stop the movement of the rudder so it will not overturn. These are adjusted. Once they're adjusted, they stay that way. Here would be the linkage for the rudder. You have top and bottom. We looked at the top a second ago. Underneath, for the landing gear, for the rear landing gear, you see this leaf spring that gives some spring to it and absorbs some of the shock for landing. Here you see a cotter pin on a nut, and at front you also see a cotter pin and a nut. Coming back on top, cotter pin, come around, and you look underneath from this side and you get a good view of the underside of the elevator from the front. So you check there and make sure no rocks have kicked up and caused any tears in the fabric. Here is the handle that you can actually use to move the rear of the plane around. It's connected to the frame. As we move forward, it's a good time to look at the fuselage, top and on the side, to make sure there's no tears or dings. As we did on the other side, you look at the connection plate. This is just connect the two surfaces together between the wing and the fuselage. You check the screws, make sure they're good. Going underneath, we'll check the fuel. You would check the doors to make sure they latch appropriately, and they do. You check the hinges, bolts for each hinge. moving down to down here, you would see where the struts would come in and connect to the fuselage. You have bolts and cotter pins. Under here you'd have bolts and cotter pins. It's a good time to look at the landing gear, main landing gear. You'd see that you have the bolts as they should be. There's no fluid. Moving up the rear strut, you have a bolt here, and for the front, same thing at the top. So you continue to move on up. And here we get a picture of the other aileron, the right aileron. Again, we're looking for the nut, the cotter pin nuts on this, and it should move freely. Go to the center one. This is where you have another attach point with a cotter pin and the push rod that comes off the yoke inside, and a cotter pin. Free movement, nothing's binding. Move to the outside, again check for the cotter pin and the appropriate bolts, and look back underneath, make sure nothing's tore, nothing's been hit. Good time to look on the outside. Again, you can tell how the ailerons move, and look at the top part of the wing. As you come around, notice even though this plane does not have an electrical system, it is wired for nav lights. So you have the two, red and green on this side, and the white in back, even though you can install a battery and hook those lights up. Here you examine the leading wing, leading edge for the wing. And again, you can look at the overall appearance for the strut as it comes down. Look at the front tire. You want to notice the condition of the tire and the thread to see how much thread you got. When you make landings, it takes a little bit of rubber off of it. So you want to check that to make sure it's good, make sure it's inflated appropriately. As we come up, we'll go check that a little bit. Come around to the propeller. Of course, this is a wooden prop, and you can see the different laminates in it, several laminates in it. You want to check the leading edge. In this case, it's got a metal leading edge. That assists in not having too much wear on the wood. If it was just wood, then it would tend to wear out much more quickly. And you check the leading edge to make sure there's no dings or dents, any significant. This is a point to check the bolts on front, make sure they're all tightened as they should be. You can actually give it a shake to make sure nothing's wiggling, nothing's loose. Look inside the cowling, make sure there's no bird nests in there. This would be a good place for a bird to get up in there. You check here as well as you would check the filter here, air filter. On this side, check for the same thing. While you're at the front, look under, you can actually see the manifold exhaust pipe here. You have the emergency locator transmitter antenna and the communication antenna. While this aircraft does not have an internal radio, we do have an external radio that we can hook up, and it has for an external antenna that you can hook that up to. Anytime before you fly, you always want to check the fuel on board visually to make sure the amount that you have, to make sure it's accurate. And on this one, you remove the cap. It says remove before flight. And in this case, there's two sides of it. You have the side for the wings and the side for the main fuel tank. The capacity of the main fuel tank is 12 gallons. So we stick that in, make sure it's clean. Go down to the bottom, bring it up, and our level is approximately 7 gallons in the main tank. At this point, you would replace the fuel cap with the fuel cap that actually allows for the float to go down and up. This gives you a visual reference to how much fuel you have in the main tank. So you insert that, and you would attach it like that. This goes up and down freely, and it goes down to the level that's in the tank. In this case, if it goes down to that, you know that you have approximately 4 to 5 gallons in the tank when you get to that point. Each inch on here pretty much represents a gallon. So you can see now that we had 7 gallons at this point. So you can see that as this sticks up, it would indicate about 4 to 5 gallons, probably closer to 4 when this gets down to this point here. Anytime before you fly, you always want to check the fuel on board visually to make sure the amount that you have, to make sure it's accurate. And on this one, you remove the cap. It says remove before flight. And in this case, there's 2 sides of it. You have the side for the wings and the side for the main fuel tank. The capacity of the main fuel tank is 12 gallons. So we stick that in, make sure it's clean. Go down to the bottom, bring it up, and our level is approximately 7 gallons in the main tank. At this point, you would replace the fuel cap with the fuel cap that actually allows for the float to go down and up. This gives you a visual reference to how much fuel you have in the main tank. So you insert that, and you would attach it like that. This goes up and down freely, and it goes down to the level that's in the tank. In this case, if it goes down to that, you know that you have approximately 4 to 5 gallons in the tank when you get to that point. Each inch on here pretty much represents a gallon. So you can see now that we had 7 gallons at this point. So you can see that as this sticks up, it would indicate about 4 to 5 gallons, probably closer to 4 when this gets down to this point here. It should have a blue cast to the fuel. That tells us that it's 100 low lead, and that's what we want. We look for any water. Water is heavier than aviation fuel, so the water would settle to the bottom, and we don't see any. And we look for any trash, and we don't see any. And again, we check the fuel on the right tank. Same way, push it up, drain enough, make sure it stops dripping. Again, we check for the correct color, which is blue. That tells us we've got the correct gas in it. There's no trash and no water. Engine. We look for anything that might be out of place on this side, as well as we check the engine fuel drain inside. When this comes up, gives us a chance to look inside, make sure everything looks as it should. No bird nest, no dirt dauber nest. On the inside, you can see the 2 cylinders on this side, as we saw on the other side. Here are the magneto wires. It goes to the spark plug wires. Here's the magneto, left and right. Everything inside looks as it should. This is where we actually drain fuel from the engine, right down here. And we stick it in. We drain some, just like we did on the side. Make sure it's not dripping. Bring the fuel out. You see that it's got a blue cast to it, no trash. and no water.